Hi, and welcome to the Passionistas Project podcast, where we talk with women who are following their passions to inspire you to do the same. We're Amy and Nancy Harrington, and today we're talking with Lynn Harris, the CEO and founder of Gold Comedy, the online comedy world for young women and non-binary folks who want to nerd out about comedy together. Lynn is also a creative partner to select brands, organizations, and individuals, blending her experience in writing, communications, advocacy, and entertainment to create strategic content that brings maximum fun to serious issues for maximum impact. So please welcome to the show, Lynn Harris.
Thank you.
What's the one thing you're most passionate about?
Besides salt, I'm into salt and I'm into comedy is power. Yeah, I'm passionate about a lot of things. But I think the most on-brand thing for me to say right now is comedy is power, and I'm passionate about comedy as power. And that's why it matters to me who's got the mic, so to speak.
So what does that mean? What does comedy as power mean, and why is it so important who has the mic?
Certainly at an individual level and at a cultural level, when you make people laugh, you make people listen. And comedy really has been, at the sort of level of joke and at the level of industry and at the level of culture, has really been defined by kind of a small, narrow group of people since the beginning, which is weird. Because if you think about it, comedy, everyone thinks of comedy as this outsider art that you get into comedy because like the underdog and you're punching up at power. And why are white dudes running the whole thing? It makes no sense. I'm working to try to change that.
How are you changing that?
The more women do comedy, the more women define comedy. And that's true not just for women, but for anybody who is not a straight white dude, many of whom are very funny. But I think that comedy will be funnier if it is defined by more types of voices. And if comedy's funnier, the world's a better place, honestly. Not just because laughter is the best medicine, which it's like the second best. The COVID vaccine is the best, but also because comedy affirms connections. When you laugh at a joke, that means you get the joke. And when you get the joke, that means you're in on something. You got the reference, you followed the comic on their bait and switch. And a lot of people say that, that's the reason that comedy brings people together. I'm not super convinced that it does, because for better and for worse, I think it sort of affirms who we are. Not that it doesn't have something to teach us, which I can circle back to, but I think comedy does affirm who we are and what we think is funny and what we think is important. And it can also change that to some degree. It can, because as comedy, comedy kind of is sort of a funhouse mirror for culture. And what we're allowed to laugh at can change for better and for worse, usually for better. The arc of, let's see, how can I destroy that quote? The arc of comedy, what is it? They have bends toward justice, right? As things become okay to say, not okay to say, I think that's both a driver and a reflection of culture evolving. And that's why it's important to have, for a lot of us, to be in charge of how that culture is evolving.
So let's take a step back. Tell us a little bit about your childhood, and when was the first time you remember that you were funny?
Okay, this is so dumb. But I remember I was, 6, 7, I don't know. And my mother was kind of the kind of person who, like, if you sneezed, she would be like, what's wrong? And I remember I was little, 5 or 6, whatever. And she said, and she heard me cough, or like I said something, I don't know what. And she said, are you okay? You're a little hoarse. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm a little child. Obviously, my parents thought that was side splitting. And I got a big laugh, and I was like, getting laughs is fun. That's the first one I remember. By the way, I have moved away from puns. Another time they were building like a new or renovating our bathroom in the house I grew up in. And so there was like the frame for a closet, but there was nothing in it yet. It was just like the space was defined. And so I went into the closet And I said, look, it's a Lynn in closet. That's where it all began, folks.
So was humor always a part of your household? Like, were your parents funny?
Yeah, my parents are funny. My parents in very different ways. And they also, but in very different ways, but they definitely, both of their families were also super funny in very different ways. But at the end of the day, they really they liked a good joke. They just really liked a good joke, a funny movie, funny TV show. It was definitely like a high value currency.
What sparked your interest in comedy, and did you immediately want to pursue a career in it?
Maybe the career part came when I was a little older and wanted to find ways to upset my parents as opposed to delight them. But I always just gravitated toward, I never defined or pursued a career in a certain kind of comedy, a certain kind of way. Like I did stand up for a long time, but my goal in doing stand up was to do stand up. So I didn't, which is nice because it kind of took the pressure off. I worked at it, but I didn't attach, not that this is a bad thing, by the way, this is a completely legitimate and great thing. My goal at the time wasn't to like get on a show or get an agent and move to LA or whatever it was. So either it just means I was just content, or just that I was really not at all ambitious. I just really like stand up. I just like it as an art form. I just like it. I never attached it to a next level dream. And then I just kind of stopped doing it when I just got tired, when I just couldn't stay up past 10 anymore, basically. I used to host shows that started at 10, and now I'm like, I don't know. And I'm not a napper, so I just powered through. I just always gravitated toward basically like the wacky redhead. Not the lead, but the lead's weird friend. Like the Janine Garofalo character in The Truth About Cats and Dogs. Not to directly compare myself to Her Majesty, but Janine Garofalo, but that idea was like always my jam. I think in high school, I had a pretty good experience overall, but I went to a very preppy high school, and I had they were very nice, but very preppy classmates who were sort of all tall and lithe and blonde, none of which describes me. And they could like burst into lacrosse the way that like the Fame kids burst into song. And so it just I wasn't like miserable. It just was not, that was the central culture, and I was not in that. And so I think I defined myself against it even harder by being like the theater kid who played the goofy roles. That was just it. I probably would have been that anyway, but I think I probably kind of defined myself against the lacrosse team in that way. When I was in high school, I went on a ski trip. It was a Jewish youth group ski trip up to this winter wonderland that was called every year. It's still going on. This is the 80s. It's still happening. And we all went up to Manchester, New Hampshire to ski and do other stuff for the weekend. And on the Saturday night, a bunch of dudes somehow got a hold of like some grapefruits and some borrowed nightgowns, and went and did this completely made up impromptu improvised drag skit in the social hall that brought the house down. And it was sloppy, it was made up, there's nothing inherently funny about dudes dressing as women, but it brought the house down. And my first thought was, okay, what are the girls going to do? And my next thought was, because I knew even then that girls would not be received the same way. We could not be equally sloppy and bring the house down. Not because we're not funny, but because that's not the way people view women as funny. Or, it's just, women don't have that kind of audience. We didn't we maybe more now, definitely not back then. And so like I just kind of, my third thought, my first thought was, what are we doing? Second thought was, and my third thought was, and so I didn't say, come on, Debbie and Jenny, let's go. So I didn't say anything. And I don't regret that, because I think my instincts were correct. But I was bummed out about it for years, and it really stuck with me. It really stuck with me. I had this real sense that was not cool and not fair, and something would have to change. And so who knows, but that may be. Oh, and fun fact, one of those dudes may or may not have been Adam Sandler, who was there. So I, as a civilian, it was his high school. So I have Adam Sandler to thank for gold comedy and what I'm doing now, I think.
So that was high school. Where did you go to college, and what did you decide to focus on when you were in college?
I went to, as we all like to say, I went to college in New Haven, and very much enjoyed the pizza, by the way, in New Haven. As a New York pizza snob, I will say that New Haven's even better. So yeah, I went to college at Frank Pepe's, and there was improv. This is the 80s. There was improv. I believe there was maybe a sketch group, but there was no awareness. There's no stand-up group. Like now I hear they have stand-up groups, and I'll get back to that. But I didn't do like straight up comedy in college. What I did do was I was in an a cappella singing group, once again continuing on my nerd track, and I am not a great singer, but what came naturally for me was doing the shtick in between the songs. And so I became the ringleader of those things, and that's where I kind of scratched the comedy itch.
So what did you do after college? Did you pursue a career in comedy, or did you do something else?
I was always drawn to being a writer. That was always just I never decided that was what I was going to do. I just kind of knew that I was going to do something where I had to write words. And I just had this tractor beam of wanting to be some form of writer, not in the way that like I thought about it. I didn't think about it. I didn't like journal about dreaming of being a writer, and I didn't watch movies about thoughtful writers, and I just knew it. And so after college, so I did a lot of journalism in college also. And after college, that's really where I focused in terms of, it didn't occur to me I could really make money as doing comedy. I loved theater, and I loved being on stage, but I knew that I didn't have the gumption or the moxie I just didn't think I wanted to go to LA and compete with anybody in that world. And I just didn't see myself as really an actor. I saw myself as more of a ham or just a wise ass than a serious actor. So it didn't really occur to me to head to Hollywood or even New York for a few years. I went back to Boston for a little while. And then, but I started taking stand-up classes when I lived in Boston, when I lived laundry distance from home, basically. I actually started freelancing as a journalist, and I took a stand-up class, and I also had a day job. My dad is a retired MIT professor. My dad's actually a very famous phonologist, which means that about 7 people know who he is, and that he's a heartbeat away from Noam Chomsky, which made me very popular. And I had an office job at MIT that I'm sure was pure nepotism. So I called myself the rejectionist. So I sat at a desk and told students that they had the wrong forms. But then more and more, as I was able to get paid more and more for journalism, I phased out. My night job became my day job. And then I also started doing stand-up in Boston and Cambridge.
Tell us about your work as a journalist, because we saw that you wrote the first national mainstream article about dating violence. And what kind of topics were you writing about, and what drew you to those topics?
That is a true story about, you remember, Parade magazine, the insert, which is, frankly, if you want to get an issue out there, I think it has had, I'm going to get this wrong, but either the first, second, or third largest circulation of anything. And so I did make a choice back then based on 2 things. I always cared a lot about various social justice issues, influenced by my parents, especially my mom. And especially I wound up caring the most about gender justice and related, feminist stuff. Back then we were not as nuanced about what we meant by gender justice. It was much more narrow focus on women's rights and probably white women's rights, I'm sure. But, I thank my mom for, making being a feminist not a rebellion. So I gravitated toward social issues, social justice issues, especially. I was always really interested in how pop culture reflects or shapes culture. As before, when I was talking about comedy, I've always been interested in that in any culture, in any form. When Ellen came out, it mattered. And culture had led it to be okay for that to happen. But then when she did it, it also changed culture. Like, it's back and forth. And I just cared about it, mainly because I really love television. And in all seriousness, I think it matters. And there was always some combination of what gets me out of bed in the morning is social justice, and what keeps me up at night is television, burning the candle at both ends. And so somehow, first it just kind of happened, but then I evolved into making a real choice about choosing to write for the most mainstream possible publications about issues that would kind of push them a little bit, push things a little bit, maybe not push the publication, but push people a little bit. And even if I had to do a little bit more like both sidesing or whatever to appear balanced or whatever, and maybe I wouldn't write it quite as aggressively as I would write it for a real, like a lefty, we didn't have blogs then, but blog. I made the choice, also financial, because they paid more, I wasn't that noble, to write for, I kind of got lucky with Parade, but not lucky, I worked hard on that, but I wound up gravitating toward women's magazines also, which were terrible in many ways, but way more feminist than people ever thought. Way more aware. Like, anyone who didn't think Cosmo was performance art nobody should waste any time being angry at Cosmo. I never understood that. And so I wrote a lot for Glamour, and Glamour was way ahead of a lot of those. They went back and forth a little bit after Ruth Whitney, but under Ruth, Glamour had this column about all the female senators, all of them, the legions of female senators that reported on exactly what they were doing, exactly what they were and weren't doing for Glamour readers. You're not going to find that elsewhere. No one else wrote about the women senators. Nobody cared. And Glamour would write, way back then, would write about abortion and all those things. And sure, their audience was huge and included people who were anti-abortion. But then when I got to write about it, I wasn't preaching to the choir necessarily. And you can humanize the issue, and you can really actually change hearts and minds a little. And so that's what I gravitated toward. And I was able to eventually, I worked so hard at writing for so many different types of publications. I wrote for a sewing newsletter. I wrote for, obviously, Glamour, tons of different publications, each with their own style. And the most important thing I learned was, aside from feeling that I was, in some cases, doing something important, the most important skill I learned was to be able to write in the publication's voice and not be all fancy about that. Because I wasn't writing to express myself. I was writing because I liked writing. And I just wasn't all precious about that. It was a fun game to be like, okay, how do I write about this thing in that voice? And how do I channel that voice? It's interesting. It's a project. It's a puzzle. It's not, it wasn't about, like, that's what you do in your journey. For those of you watching the podcast, I'm listening to the podcast, I'm miming some sort of like kind of BS self-expression, but like, you learn how to deliver a product, and it's fun. Only after you learn how to do that do you really get to a place, I think, where you then get assignments from people who are asking you to write in your voice. So that eventually, after I worked for years and years and wrote probably thousands of articles, I can't even remember, then I was able to do things like for Salon and other publications where they'd be like, no, please, you do you. And really have my own voice. I wrote a bunch of different columns in my, that were supposed to be, I wrote a column for the Daily News, like things that were supposed to sound like me, not sound like them. But that is not where you start. And it's so much the better, the better for it. It's like TV. I mean, Amy, our mutual friend, Amy Tuman Strauss, is teaching for Gold Comedy now. And we were talking to her about what to teach and when, and what are the different things that she could teach. And I do sort of hear and feel out there that everyone's like, well, I got a great idea for a show. And because rightly, things have been so, the platforms have been so democratized now that like, you could do, you could write your, put your show on YouTube, and maybe, maybe it'll get picked up, or maybe, that it's not that doesn't happen now. But Amy's point was, yeah, but I don't want to teach how to write your own show first. I want to teach how to write someone else's show. And it's the same thing. Learning how to show, you needing to be able to show a showrunner that you understand, obviously, the basics that apply anywhere and everywhere, but also how to write for that show, how to channel those characters, those voices, those situations, how to replicate that world. And so that's the analog that I really learned in journalism, of learning how to write the other stuff first. Then you get to do your own thing. It works the same way in stand-up. Not that you should go around telling other people's jokes or writing other people's jokes for them. It doesn't really start that way, unless you're Ava on Hacks, which we love. And she didn't start that way either. But anyway, the point is, 201, almost comedians I know, or people who either teach or mentor comedians, always say, find the comedians that you like and learn them, know them, live them, and even go ahead and do the exercise of writing jokes like theirs. Obviously, you can't go and do that and get paid for that, or there's a point past which that's stealing. But just the imitation and the practice is really helpful, and helps you learn how any joke works.
We're Amy and Nancy Harrington, and you're listening to the Passionistas Project podcast and our interview with Lynn Harris. If you're a young woman or identify as non-binary and want to turn your sense of humor into your superpower, visit goldcomedy.com. If you're enjoying this interview and would like to help us to continue creating inspiring content, please consider becoming a patron by visiting thepassionistasproject.com/podcast and clicking on the patron button. Even $1 a month can help us continue our mission of inspiring women to follow their passions. Now here's more of our interview with Lynn. So in 1997, you found your own voice and you created Breakup Girl.
Co-created, yes.
So tell us about that character and the show and how it expanded as time and technology evolved.
I co-created Breakup Girl with Chris Kolb. So in 97, it was much, much easier to get a book contract. You didn't have to already have a blue check mark. You didn't already have to have a Substack or whatever. Like you really just had to have a good idea. Seriously. I had an idea about writing a humor book about surviving a breakup. And I went to bat to have Chris, who's a brilliant illustrator, and we had collaborated before. I went to bat to have Chris have us be a package deal and be the designer and illustrator of the book, which also would never happen now. So we actually realized we were roommates in a different block, and we were sitting there figuring out all the real estate and what we had written and what he had designed. And we realized we had like a few more, like we had like 12, 16 more pages to fill. And we were like, and then Chris was like, I was just kind of thinking that I don't know, there should be like a superhero character. And I was like, what? Oh my God, we should have done that from the beginning. And so we created this. It was originally Chris's idea, but from that moment we collaborated and came up with the idea of the superhero who helps people with romantic emergencies. I mean, we have superheroes who can bend steel bars, but how about one that can mend broken hearts? And so that we invented this kind of classic, like kind of a winking version of a classic superhero who had like a utility fanny pack and who's actually really smart and thoughtful character who had her own problems, was able to help others. And so we added her origin story and all this other stuff in the book and added her as this voice and presence in the book. And then the book did okay, but people were like, but I like that character. And so that was in 96, I don't remember, 96. And then in 97, Chris was like, there's this thing that mostly NASA uses, but it's called the World Wide Web. And I think it would be super fun to make a page on the World Wide Web about Breakup Girl. And so we created a website in 97 that was literally an overnight success because no one else was doing anything remotely like it. And we just did it. We did the thing that does not happen now, which is we built it and they came. That hasn't happened since. But the advice column, I decided to write an advice column. It got super popular. I think it was, Chris's artwork is amazing, but I do think that, and this goes back to the idea of the intersection of pop culture and social change. what we were doing that was different, and this was intentional. We kind of wandered into this enterprise, but once we kind of got our bearings, the part that was intentional was that it was not going to be a female superhero talking to women about relationships, because that's stupid and it's reductive. And in the world, at least of like binary heterosexual people, half the people in relationships are dudes. So like, why is it thought of as like this lady thing? That's so stupid. And we kept coming up against that, because then people would assume that because Breakup Girl was female and because we were talking about relationships, that it was a site for women. And it never was. It never was. We made it about relationships, and we wanted to change. We were like intentional about this. We wanted to change the way people thought and talked about relationships. So from the very beginning, the letters that we would get online were not even close to all from women. So many from dudes, and we had letters from people that we have different words for now. People would say, "Dear Breakup Girl, I'm a secret cross-dresser. My wife doesn't know." And all these things that we talked to gay people and straight people and trans people and blah, 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 all these things that no one else was doing. Not because we were like brilliant, but because it was intentional, that we really did think it was dumb that only half the people in relationships were talking about relationships or had a place to talk about relationships. I think that, plus the combination of humor, she had a really specific style of nerdy superhero comic book humor that people felt comfortable with and was nice to everybody. It got really big. And then the property we got acquired by Oxygen, and in a really kind of great deal, because they hired us. They didn't buy it away from us. They bought us with it. So we got hired to create it for Oxygen on an even bigger platform. And that all went straight to hell a while later, but that's a story for a less jaunty podcast. But now we actually we're playing around with a new version. A lot of the stuff that she talked about is eternal, but a lot of it is like, we talked about like computer dating. And so, some of that stuff has to be updated.
You have so many things that we could talk to you about, but let's focus a little bit on Gold Comedy. When and why did you start that?
Well, that part goes back to Adam Sandler and wanting to, and also having done stand-up myself. And I didn't have, a lot of women who worked a lot harder at it than I did and did a lot more of it than I did have much worse stories about everything from just garden variety sexism to outright harassment. And not just the harassment itself, but I didn't really get into the whole world that many other women did, where you actually make choices about jobs that you don't take, and jobs that aren't even offered to you because you can't work with that guy, or because that guy already has a woman, or whatever. So even my mild experiences were exhausting and outrageous. And all paths led to this idea of making sure that women, especially young women, and anyone else outside the comedy norm, which is often a white dude named Norm, had access to the fun of comedy and the power of comedy. And it matters. It matters because women are people, and it matters because comedy is a job, and it matters because comedy is power. And I just had this idea of how much better would the world be if we had an even broader idea of who's funny, or who makes us think, or who helps us process that day's crazy news. And I thought, what if I just start building the farm team? And so now it's gone through various forms in reality and in my mind. But now what we have is and this was, by the way, I was envisioning this online long before anyone knew about any kind of COVID or pandemic, because part of the vision for me was, first of all, I don't recommend starting a brick and mortar place in New York City because it's expensive. But also I wanted to find the funny young people, and not even young people, who don't live in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, Toronto. Where can we find the Carrie Underwood of comedy? If they can zoom in from Chakota and they're funny, then great. So I always had this idea of creating an online school and community, an online place of learning and social interaction where you could find your comedy crew no matter where you live and get the learning and collaboration and interaction and helping each other out that I did get from my crew in New York, and many people do, but it's hard to find. And again, what if you don't live in New York, or what if you're not old enough to go to clubs? We opened, again, went through lots of different ideas and permutations, but we opened our current members only club last fall. And so we now have this amazing online platform, which is powered by a company called Mighty Networks. Basically, like, they built the bones of the app and we just bring our people and our stuff. And we have a place where women and young women and non-binary folks come to, let's see, Mondays, we have open mics with feedback. Like, they're the nicest open mics in the world. Plus you get feedback from me and your peers. Tuesdays and Thursdays usually are when we have our courses. Right now we're in the middle of a stand-up course. We just finished improv. We've also done storytelling and sketch, which, yes, you can do all of this online. Every Wednesday, we have a Q&A with a comedy pro or celebrity. We've had writers who have toiled in the trenches, whose names you don't know, but whose shows you know, to Rachel's Dratch and Bloom, Ashley Nicole Black from a Black Lady sketch show, like an amazing range of people. And you just show up in the Zoom and ask them, like, you totally just fangirl out and ask them questions. We have monthly shows that are open to the public. We pay our own comics for performing because it's work and we want to set that tone, set that precedent. We just did a Pride show, which was amazing, with Murray Hill and Sydney Washington. And so we basically just create the experiences that young or new, or not even new medium. We have a lot of comedians in the gang who have been doing comedy for a little while, but still want to find the people in the place to really nerd out and really like level up as fast as they can. And we have folks, I think our youngest is an 8th grade. We have a couple in 8th grade, and then all the way up to people my age. And then we just launched a course that's outside the members club. So you get all that with a subscription. It's all inclusive with a subscription. Then we have a one-off course that we call Gold Label, which is being taught by your friend and mine, Amy Tuman Strauss, who is the one who wrote the one with the embryos on Friends. And she's teaching in a 3-course series about TV writing, TV comedy writing. And that's open to people inside and outside of the club. It's really it's the place to to level up your work and find your crew. And it's great if there's a lot of like improv for team building and stuff like that, which is great. But we really present comedy as a path to comedy. It's comedy for comedy. However, there are many people, we also attract a lot of people who may or may not want to be professional comedians in whatever capacity, stand-up writers, whatever, but who know that comedy skills are life skills. And they like comedy. So they're like, well, that's perfect. I can use this thing I love to learn how to, write better, think faster, listen better, get out of my head, stop self-editing, react more quickly. All those things are things you can do. And find your voice, which sounds abstract and woo-woo, but it's a thing. Understand what's your unique take on things. You can do all that. So we have a real mix of people at sort of at varying levels of intensity around their comedy career goals. But there's room for everybody.
How does the average person get involved? How do people become a part of this?
Funny you should ask. All you need to do is visit our website, which has a lot of free resources on it. Also, I believe the irritating term for that is freemium. We have lots of articles and useful, snackable, actionable resources to help you just kind of learn the basics of joke writing and how to make your PowerPoint funnier without being too much of a dork. So there's just a ton of free resources, and then. If folks are interested in joining what we call the club, the Gold Comedy Club, you can click right through from our website to there and learn more about that. Frankly, the price is amazing. And frankly, it's going to go up. So one of these days, so it's $299.99 a year for all of that stuff. Anything we do in the club, you get. Any course, all of our self-paced, we have a ton of one-off classes that are just an hour with, a writer from James Corden talking about topical jokes, You can just nerd out with all and just inhale all of that stuff. You can take our live, live on Zoom classes, all those things. So that's all with that one price. So, and then we record and archive everything that we do. So you also have active, that's why eventually the price is going to go up, because our resource library is getting bigger literally every week. So it's really, really fun. And I will say this, as much as I'm proud of all the resources, and I'm, happy to like drop all the names of the famous people who have, who swing by and answer questions. And I'm happy to talk about the quality of the instruction and all that stuff. Really the thing is the community. Really the thing. And because all these people who have literally never met, unless it's their friend that they brought in, are like this incredibly supportive, like cheering section for each other. And people will post like stuff they're working on and get feedback. People will come to other classes, final shows, just to cheer the others on. People really have, we have a lot of few people who have now done open mics for the first time because they felt, got the skills and the confidence from us. And now like people are going, now that we can do this, people who live in the same city are like starting to go see the other people in real life, and it's a whole thing. So it's really it's that kind of, safe, supportive, ad-free, welcoming place that you can get. And most comedians say like the most important thing is to find your crews. You can do that, but this is not instead of, if you start doing comedy in some city and you meet your friends, it's not instead of that, but this one is going to be there for you wherever you are, and all the time, and it's on your phone. It's really, that's the most moving thing that I've seen. It was my goal, so I'm not surprised, but I'm delighted that it really has turned out that way.
Thanks for listening to the Passionistas Project podcast and our interview with Lynn Harris. If you're a young woman or identify as non-binary and want to turn your sense of humor into your superpower, visit goldcomedy.com. Please visit thepassionistasproject.com to learn more about our podcast and subscription box filled with products made by women-owned businesses and female artisans to inspire you to follow your passions. Use the code FALLMYSTERY to get a free mystery box with a 1-year subscription. And be sure to subscribe to the Passionistas Project podcast so you don't miss any of our upcoming inspiring guests. Until next time, stay well and stay passionate.